Although I maintain that the original Tomb Raider is still an absorbing and atmospheric action-adventure to this day, context is really important when you're trying to evaluate this game. Tomb Raider was released in the early days of 3D. Its arrival coincided with a huge technological upswing in console hardware. This explosion of technology for both console and PC gaming meant that games could now be bigger, more ambitious, more detailed, and they could be rendered in real-time 3D. Developers were still figuring out how best to make real-time 3D games. There were some minor successes and there were many failures. Many of the things Tomb Raider does are just taken for granted these days, particularly camera movement and control. But at the time, there were no real paradigms for how to make this kind of game. Even big-budget, high-profile releases like Fade to Black, the sequel to Flashback, struggled to make a cohesive, engaging gameplay experience in a fully 3D environment. Mario 64 and Tomb Raider arrived in '96 and played a huge role in solidifying third-person 3D action games. And I would actually argue that Tomb Raider has aged a little better in some ways, in the 3D camera stakes at least. It's hard to put into words how this opening stretch made you feel if you weren't of a certain age at that time. The freedom of movement, the meticulous animation, the cavernous depth of the environments, the sense of isolation and mystery, the through-the-looking-glass quality of wandering out freely into truly expansive 3D environments for arguably the first time ever. And perhaps most of all, the near silence. It was powerful stuff indeed. I'll never forget wandering into an HMV, I think it was, in Glasgow. Funnily enough, we were having a city break with my family at the time, and catching sight of this thing running on the wall-mounted CRTs there. Even my mum and dad were thoroughly impressed with the beautiful, elegant animation and the atmosphere of this large-scale 3D environment. The only bit they didn't like was how you have to shoot wolves in the face. But you can't have everything, can you? I got it a couple of weeks later for my birthday, I think, and to this day, the original Tomb Raider is one of the most atmospheric and absorbing games ever. And yes, I like the first game the best. The combat system was excellent and still manages to impress. Instead of some tortuous targeting system, Lara locks on to the nearest threat and holds it in her sights until it's eliminated. And while she's doing this, you can pull off all manner of cool evasive flips and rolls. These kinds of acrobatics were and still are a joy to pull off once you get to grips with Lara's almost grid-like movement pattern. And even if today we might find the controls a bit clunky, we press on to experience more of Core Design's amazing underground world. The early levels in Peru were impressive, the giant T-Rex looming out of the darkness was really a wow moment, of course. But it was Lara's arrival in Greece, and particularly St. Francis's Folly, that showcased the game's exemplary level design. Level, inverted commas, is perhaps the wrong word because these were proper 3D environments, alive with atmosphere and begging to be explored. There were spine-tingling moments usually triggered by the game's orchestral score, when the ambience was tangible and it felt like you really were deep underground in a dusty old tomb, walking in the footsteps of civilizations long gone.
Here lies Tehokan, one of the two just rulers of Atlantis, who even after the curse of the continent had tried to keep rule here in these barren other lands. He died without child, and his knowledge has no heritage. Look over us kindly to Hoken.
She's got vital statistics that put the latest Barbie doll to shame. Her new blockbuster has sold 3 million copies. She currently adorns billboards and magazines across the world with her latest release this weekend. And she's British. She's also available for a computer date. In fact, that's the only way you'll ever meet her, because her name is Lara Croft, and she is, to put it baldly, a computer graphic. Lara Croft is literally an international icon, the virtual heroine of the computer game Tomb Raider, and she's made her British creators an awful lot of money.
Despite being synonymous with the original PlayStation, Tomb Raider developer Core Design, based not too far away from me actually, in Derby, England, had a close relationship with Sega at that time. Between 89 and 95, Core Design pumped out a huge amount of titles across numerous systems. Sega and Core's relationship began with Core porting Action Fighter and Dynamite Ducks to Amiga and Atari consoles. Soon they moved into developing original software for Sega's major home consoles. Their games weren't always hits. They were, however, always innovative. Core was seemingly eager to develop for new platforms, tailoring each game to the limits and possibilities of the hardware. My main experience personally with Core Design's Sega games outside of Tomb Raider are some of the awesome titles on the Mega CD, such as Soulstar, Thunderhawk and Battlecore. But if you look at a list of titles they developed, there were many good ones across a variety of platforms. The games were always polished, often featured really advanced graphical effects, such as the sprite scaling you can see here, cool art design, and they had awesome soundtracks too, generally speaking. Core Design were great, and their relationship with Sega was very fruitful, and sure enough, Tomb Raider was first released for the Sega Saturn. So this here is the first release of Tomb Raider, the PAL Sega Saturn release. This is the version I had back in the day. I got the PC one a little later on, and that's the version you're looking at here. Tomb Raider was the work of a surprisingly small development team. Paul H. Douglas, 3D System Animation System / Editor, Jason Gosling, Front End, Gavin Rummery, Room Editor, Camera System, AI / Baddies, artists Neil Boyd, Level Designer, Toby Gard, Animation, Heather Gibson, Level Designer.
I'm Toby Gard and I'm the creator of Lara Croft. For me, the core of Tomb Raider is discovering the mystery, uncovering things that are, really gobsmacking and being impressed by it. So, originally, when I was thinking about Lara Croft, it was very much the opposite of what game characters were like at the time. There's a lot of sarcastic, sort of monosyllabic sort of heroes, and I wanted Lara to just be the opposite of that. So I wanted her to be this extremely refined, genteel lady who just had this steely disposition, who, you know, would quite happily kill you as soon as look at you. And that terrifying danger underneath the surface of extreme refined, you know, pleasantries seemed like an excellent choice.
Widely regarded as the main man behind the early Tomb Raider games, Toby Gard had this to say about the genesis of the game. I wanted an alternative view to all that first-person Doom shit of which there is far too much. Tomb Raider is a cross between Prince of Persia, which is an excellent game for traps and pitfalls, and the Indiana Jones films. He hit the nail on the head right there, I think. That's exactly how this game feels to me. So how does Prince of Persia come into it, some of you may ask? Well, let's take a look and pay close attention to the animation of Lara and the Prince, and the sort of systematic, modular way Lara interacts with her world. Yeah, it may feel somewhat robotic by today's standards, but one thing it absolutely does have, and which a lot of games to this day don't really have in fact, is a real feeling of weight and heft to our player character, and a sense that she is absolutely a part of an ancient and very perilous three-dimensional environment of stone, iron and cold bodies of water, and that you absolutely have to navigate it with due care, attention and forethought. It forces us to slow down and really think carefully about what we're going to do next, about the distance of each and every jump, about the crumbling ground beneath our little pointy feet. Likewise, there's no obvious breadcrumb trail or hint system here. Some of the levels here are sprawling, but with due care and attention and lots of perseverance, we can almost always find our way to the exit. Let's compare it to a more modern game, say Uncharted 4 for example, which I did really enjoy for the record. In Tomb Raider, you can't just leap at a load of random foliage and start whizzing up it like a spider monkey at any given moment. In Tomb Raider, the environments are absolutely lethal, and your greatest threat is the environment itself, be it by misjudging a jump and crumbling like a wet biscuit at the bottom of some cold, dank pit, or getting skewered by a bamboo trap like some unsuspecting GI in a Vietnamese jungle. Uncharted relies on throwing endless numbers of enemies at you to give you a sense of jeopardy, and it gets increasingly silly as your wisecracking, lovable rogue commits ever-increasing acts of complete and utter genocide.
Avast, you dirty dog!
Nice.
I was doing the...
Oh, yeah, no, I know.
I was doing the thing.
Right.
As fun and beautiful as the whole package is, suspension of disbelief is broken time and time again. Tomb Raider has lots of enemies too. Of course, Lara won't be making Chris Packham's Christmas card list anytime soon as she sighs through endangered species like Jim Corbett on speed. But the enemies are not a massive threat in most cases, and the number of enemies you kill stays just within the bounds of plausibility for me. Alright, yeah, some of the enemies are tough as balls, but their movement is usually pretty predictable, there aren't huge numbers of them, and if you have the right tools, it's a fairly straightforward task usually. Certainly they don't render entire battalions for you to massacre one by one like a cross between Chris Pratt and the T-800. On the topic of Tomb Raider enemies, I was watching probably my favourite active director Alex Garland's amazing film Annihilation again recently. Anyone seen this? And I noticed some striking similarities between the iridescent alien thing that mirrors Natalie Portman's every move in highly freaky fashion, and this amazing and uncanny sequence in Tomb Raider featuring an enemy that mirrors Lara's every move. This little encounter is still awesomely creepy and fascinating. I know that Garland is a big gamer himself because I've seen him interviewed in an old 90s gaming magazine, PC Zone, talking about his turbocharged Voodoo 2 SLI equipped Pentium 2 PC, and he wrote Enslaved Odyssey to the West on 360, I believe. Now, there's an underappreciated game. But is this possible, do you think? I'm not saying he based his whole movie on Tomb Raider or anything like that, that would be silly. But the spectacle and the uncanniness of it is pretty similar, I think. I hope it's true anyway. If you are Alex Garland, please send your answer on a postcard to Retro Mule Towers, P.O. Box 20. Getting back on track, even when the environment isn't actively slaughtering you, it still is by far your greatest obstacle purely because of its labyrinthine nature. Some of these levels are denser than a gang of football fans in a branch of Revolution's bar, and they can take hours and hours and hours and hours and hours to complete without the help of Game FAQs or the Games Master. The greatest challenge in this game stems from the environment itself.
You know, that's a damn rare thing these days.
And that's to be commended in my book. A lot of these elements can be seen in Prince of Persia 2. It's mentioned in the game design document, in fact. Toby Gard says that the team was inspired by its realistic animation and freedom of movement. Prince of Persia is one of those great games that was pure gameplay, he says. We wanted to recreate that sort of thing in 3D, but with loads of extra stuff thrown in for good measure. Surprisingly, Gard refers to Ultima Underworld also. At the beginning of 1994, the game industry appeared to be moving towards a glut of Ultima Underworld ripoffs like Doom, for instance. We conceived the idea of taking a corridor-style game and introducing a main character, moving away from the first-person feel. The idea was to create a game that would look as visually exciting as a cartoon, but that offered the same complete freedom of movement that Underworld had, he tells us. Lara's movements were incredible, uncanny even for their day, and they hold up well today, for me. Amazingly, no motion capture was used whatsoever. Motion capture is a bit of a non-starter for a game like this, Gard says. The problem is that in order to make something move smoothly, the various animations have to link at their crossover point. If you use motion capture, you just can't get a person to move into exactly the same position time and time again. If you look at motion capture stuff, the feet tend to jiggle around like anything. To avoid that sort of thing, you would have to spend so much time cleaning it up, you might as well have keyframed it in the first place. We also have direct control over each animation, for instance how fast Lara runs, how quickly she can come to a stop, how far she can jump. These aspects directly influence how the gameplay needs to be tweaked during the game's development. One of the key elements of this game is undoubtedly the fantastic music. Along with the fairly early use of real-time 3D graphics, full CD soundtracks were relatively new at the time, and this is one of gaming's most memorable OSTs for me. Valuing space and atmosphere over adrenaline and noise, Tomb Raider's elegant and beautiful score gave a sense of awe and scale to the adventure. Silence and timing were priorities. For example, most gamers remember the surprise T-Rex moment a few levels in, but just as many recall the silent gasps they made when, after minutes of eerie silence whilst wandering into a dark cavern, a colossal sphinx face slowly appears, gradually revealed from within the subterranean darkness, accompanied by the sounds of Gregorian chanting and solo violin. The music swells into a fuller orchestral piece while the in-game camera pans out and takes a swoop around the vista, swamping you in scale and grandeur. It's magical stuff, and the man responsible for it was Nathan McCree. In a recent interview, he talked about his involvement with the game. For the first game, he says, I think they were about 4 weeks away from completion by the time I started my work. There was stuff for me to look at, but time was short, so I really drew my inspiration from the character of Lara Croft. I talked mostly to Toby Gard about the style of music and what kind of cues would be useful for including in the game. The script for the video sequences played quite a large part in the design of the music. Ultimately, I was trying to create something similar to a movie score, but for a game. So I drew from my knowledge of movie soundtracks and also from my musical upbringing, which was largely fed by my father's obsession with classical and choral music. The darkness and isolation was influenced by the character of Lara Croft, but also it came about due to the time constraints of the project. There really wasn't much time to fill it full of audio detail, so invariably the atmosphere and musical content was sparse and minimal. As it turned out, this was actually quite advantageous, as it gave the player sonic space to think, something which is critical for solving puzzles, he tells us. I had been getting fed up of the predictable, fast-paced, bombastic action music that other game titles had been producing, and I had a thought. If gamers like movies, which have plenty of emotional musical content in them, why wouldn't they like that in a game? I had been looking for the right game, the right opportunity to test my theory, and when Tomb Raider came along, I thought, this is it. Here was a woman, a beautiful woman, an explorer who was classy, educated, sexy, witty, dangerous, and alone. It was perfect. The 90s were a bit of a cultural hotbed for games music. A lot of these old soundtracks have had a long life outside of the games themselves. Tomb Raider, Final Fantasy VII, and Silent Hill amongst many others. Nathan McCree tells us that in some ways it was a classic time. Many of the game's composers at the time had previously been working in the industry writing chip music, where tunes, inverted commas, were all the rage. When the CD consoles came out, I think many of the chip-based game composers continued writing tunes, inverted commas, into the mid and late 90s. As the industry moved forward, however, many of the new kids on the block were writing music beds, as it were, Hollywood-style movie beds, which didn't really have a melody. So there wasn't so much content to get a grip on melody-wise moving into the 2000s. I think the importance of melody is understood by some composers and developers, but also I think that melody is often sacrificed when budget and time constraints are tight, and that's not a wise move, because good music is often the thing that can really sell a product. I couldn't agree more. I really do miss melody in my films and my games, and in popular music too. So, the game on 32-bit consoles was great, but there was, of course, another release.
There is another.
The Saturn and PS1 versions were extremely impressive for their time, but the PC 3DFX release was absolutely staggering.
Switch me on.
Just take a look at these graphics. This was mesmerizing stuff. Let me just play the same sequence in software mode for you. This absolutely knocked our collective socks off in 1997 when the patch was released, and it was one of many quantum leaps in graphics made during the latter half of the 90s. The drawback, and it is a pretty big drawback in my opinion, of the PC version, is that it didn't include Nathan McCree's music cues for whatever reason. If you want to play the original game today though, you can patch the Steam version quite easily and get what is probably the definitive Tomb Raider 1 experience. I haven't tried the remasters yet. I don't think they're out, are they? I don't know. But I'm not particularly liking what they've done to the graphics, to be honest with you. I find the prospect of vanilla Tomb Raider with path-traced lighting or something like that a much more interesting prospect, personally. Anyway, folks will disagree with me, but I think the Steam version with patches is the best way to play the original game on balance.
I always knew that raiding tombs was a way toward a better and more interesting life. But all the publicity it's caused has been a bit of a surprise.
So, the game was a huge hit and had a huge impact. Lara herself changed quite a bit in the years following. You can see the tank girl influence on her design here from Tomb Raider 1, and that's how I really see Lara to this day. She was smart, strong, independent, and yeah, she was kinda sexy too, I suppose, but she wasn't just a digital masturbation tool that she became over the next few years. It's hard to get across if you weren't there at the time how big Lara was. Back in the late 90s, Lara's likeness was used to sell Lucasade. She modelled inverted commas on the front cover of the Face magazine and became a bona fide cultural phenomenon, quite outside the historic thrills of the games themselves. I've got fond memories of the second game too, but after the success of the original, it started to turn into more of a globe-trotting action-adventure 007 spectacle with tons of locations, many of which are outdoors, and loads of different revealing outfits for Lara, smoother boobs, tons of guns and explosives, and it just got progressively cheaper for me, and the magic was diminished slightly. I do really love those flares in Tomb Raider 2 though. Oh yeah, that was magic. Oh yes. I don't think the other two original games hold up quite as well. The last Revelation on Dreamcast was very cool though, I think. The key thing for me in that original game is the sense of isolation, the sense of vast expanses of time, of clawing ever and ever deeper into the bowels of the earth and discovering ancient artifacts of great power. It was quite magical. It might not have been realistic, but by God, was it effective. I'd love to see more of this kind of simplicity and atmosphere in Tomb Raider games going forward. Regardless of what happens with future installments, the original Tomb Raider is an all-time classic. Its impact on modern 3D games is not spoken of enough in the modern era, in my opinion. And most importantly, it's an absorbing, atmospheric, and quite magical game to play to this day.